Welcome to City and State TV. I'm editorial director Michael Johnson. I'm joined today by David Miranda, the president of the New York State Bar Association. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Michael.
And you guys have a lot going on. One thing that I'm very interested in is the 2017 Constitutional Convention. As someone who's followed Albany politics for more than a decade, I know that this is something that comes up every 25 years. The state's required to look at the Constitution, or at least vote on a referendum to see if there's going to be a constitutional convention. A lot of people who are good government advocates talk about how this is a great vessel to make some reforms to government, but it seems like it doesn't really happen that often. So tell us a little bit why you're forming a committee to look at this.
Okay, well, as you said, every 20 years it goes to the voters as to whether there should be a constitutional convention. So the voters get to decide. In 1997, it was on the ballot, and the voters decided not to have a constitutional convention. Things have changed certainly over the last 20 years. I think there might be a feeling amongst our voters that maybe everything in New York State government is not going as well as it could be. Maybe we could do better. And so the voters will have a chance to look at that. We think as our Bar Association, we are uniquely situated to address the issues that might be addressed if there is a constitutional convention. The New York State Constitution is 7 times larger than the U.S. Constitution. It covers very specific things about that affect the lives of everyday New Yorkers, from our criminal justice system, which is obviously very important, to how our children are educated, to the protection of our Adirondack parks. So it's much broader and in many ways much more specific than our U.S. Constitution. And our Bar Association, I'm hoping our committee will look at the various articles of the Constitution and say, here's what we have, here's what we could have, so that the voters can make an informed and balanced decision on whether this is something that they want to look at.
Do you approach this, or do you think the committee should approach this from the idea that we should have one or we shouldn't have one, or is that kind of still up for debate as well? My
feeling for our association at this time is that the yes or no issue is one that we should stay away from. What I would rather do is just look at a thoughtful analysis of what we have and what we could have. There's many things in our Constitution that are really quite good and working wonderfully. So the answer of yes or no, I think, will come down the road as we get closer. But my feeling on our committee is, if there is a Constitution, I want us to be front and center as part of the dialogue. If there isn't, and we have some good ideas, we can still use those ideas and bring them through the legislative process. There is a means of changing the Constitution on an item-by-item basis. It's much more difficult.
Yep.
You have to get 2 separate
legislators to vote
legislature
on it,
and then go to a referendum.
Yeah.
So if there's good ideas that come out of this committee, they can have a positive impact regardless of whether there's a Constitution.
Yeah, so even if there isn't a convention, you can convince the legislature to go forward and maybe go through that other process on certain specific items.
Right, exactly.
That makes sense. My sense in studying the history of these constitutional conventions is that a lot of times special interests get involved and don't want this to happen, and they kind of go through the process by directing it that way. And I bring that up only because looking at the committee, there have a lot of prominent lawyers who work for lobbying firms. So you can compare the lawyers to the top lobbyists in Albany every single year. And there is some overlap there to that sense. So again, I don't think that that's necessarily obviously why you guys put together the committee or why you selected people to the committee, but if you can explain a little bit about who was selected, why they were selected, and maybe address that issue of maybe the connection between the people who were selected and the lobbying activities they have in Albany.
Well, we have people, I want people that understand the New York State Constitution and the New York State government process.
Yeah.
And so we have judges, we have former judges from the Court of Appeals, we have individuals with judicial experience, executive branch experience, legislative experience. It's really a balanced committee, upstate, downstate.
You also have some prominent academics on there.
Academics. There are some people of lobbyists as well, but they understand how to make things work. So it's really a very balanced committee, both politically, philosophically, and that's what we wanted to have. I mean, our association is not a political organization by any means. Everything that we have is vetted internally, and we have 74,000 member association. You can't get attorneys to agree on anything, so when something comes out of our association, it's fully vetted from both sides of the issue. This committee, I think, is really, a first-class committee that's going to be able to look at this very thoughtfully.
Great. 2017 obviously is when the referendum happens. What's the timeline as far as what the committee is going to do? When are they going to have kind of like a report? And once that report comes out, how are you going to, I guess, promote that to the voters?
Yeah, our committee is great. We formed them in July. They have already got their initial report prepared. It's going to our House of Delegates on November 6th. And the first report is looking at whether the state should form a commission to look at preparation for a constitutional convention. In the past, we've looked at historically. At this time, in the past, prior to the vote, the state has formed commissions to look at, what's going to happen if there is a convention. There's a massive amount of logistics that has to be run. You've got to bring the convention to Albany right when the legislative session ends. And so there's a lot of logistics that need to be looked at. So the first report of our committee is looking at what's happened in the past and making a recommendation about whether the state should form a commission to look at the possibility of a constitutional convention. And my hope is that as we go through this, we're not going to have at the end of it a huge report that nobody's going to look at. My hope is that we'll have a bunch of mini reports that come out every few months looking at the various articles of the Constitution and focusing on that, raising the dialogue on the various very important issues to New Yorkers, and so that we can have, leading up to it, a couple of months of discussion about criminal justice system, a couple of months of discussion about our court reform, a couple of months of discussion about the environmental protections of our Constitution, so that we can really be a productive part of the dialogue.
Interesting. I wanted to move on to some other stuff. I know that the New York State New York State Bar Association is also very interested in what's going on in D.C. and with Congress. And there's been concern amongst the Bar Association about the federal sequestration, which is the budget cuts that happened because basically the Democrats and the Republicans can't agree to pass a budget and haven't been able to pass a budget really for a while now. What has been the impact of those sequestration cuts, and why do you guys focus so much on kind of what's happening there?
Well, the impact of the sequestration cuts, we warned of in the past, but now we have the experience of what happened in 2013, and there were substantial cuts to our federal judiciary. And we think the Bar Association, it's important that we go out and speak out on behalf of the judiciary in Congress. And we were just down at Congress talking to our New York congressional delegation about the importance of proper funding of our judiciary, the possible impact that we've seen in the judiciary if there is sequestration. We know what happened in 2013. There were cuts that were made across the board. There's certain things that can't be cut, judges' salaries, rents, et cetera. We had substantial cuts in security and technology, and when you cut security like that, you basically paralyze the courts because they've got to stop. If you're going to say everyone's got to leave at 4 o'clock, security's got to leave at 4 o'clock, that means the court is not going to be in session. And so we're still, it took a long time to recover from that brief period of sequestration the last time. And New York courts are amongst the most overburdened courts already, the federal courts in the nation. So the impact on a cutback in New York is more significant than in some other jurisdictions. And, the New York economy and the New York court system, I think, go hand in hand. It's important for our businesses that we have a place where disputes can be heard in a reasonable time, in a reasonable manner. And New York increasingly is a center for global dispute resolution. because of the high caliber of our courts, because of the fact that you can get your cases resolved fairly here. And so it's important that our legislators understand the importance of our court system, not only to the judiciary and to the legal profession, but to our economy and to the businesses in this state.
And I should stress that I mentioned that the sequestration cuts were cuts across the board. They
Yes.
weren't there. That was basically the deal that was reached, so that instead of targeting those, and you feel probably that the New York federal courts, maybe should have been funded at a higher level than other federal courts because of the prominence.
What I'm saying is, of course, all our federal courts should be properly funded. The impact on sequestration, I think, in New York was greater because we have such a strong caseload here.
Yeah, that makes sense. You also have a lot of priorities for 2016 that you want to get passed in Congress. Tell us a little bit about what you would hope to get done going forward into next year.
Well, one of our significant priorities is our report on gun violence that we've produced last year. Again, we had a very balanced committee with gun owners and those that were on the other side. And they came up with a very balanced report, a thorough analysis of Second Amendment law and the right to bear arms. And there was a consensus that in order to properly legislate, we need to have gun data. We need funding to be returned for the collection of gun data and where that's coming from and where it's going, and where the violence occurs, and the underlying data from that exchange of data amongst law enforcement. All of which had been cut in past years, all of which we're looking for to be recovered. And President Obama, in one of his recent remarks, also called for that. So we're very hopeful that we can have that funding returned to collection of data before we get to how we're going to start restricting guns, that we have a proper collection of data so that our legislators can make those proper decisions.
I mean, it seems to me that there's like a toxic atmosphere when it comes to talking about any gun reforms, gun control, but you think this is probably a reasonable step that maybe you can convince people to, just like collecting the data to have a more informed opinion about how to go forward?
Yes, this is, I think, a very balanced and reasonable approach. What we're saying is if there is going to be legislation, we need to have the legislation in the areas where we can do the most good. I think most people can agree that there's certain types of weapons and certain types of individuals that perhaps should be a little bit more restricted. And this data will help put us in that direction.
Great. I know you're also very interested in wrongful convictions. You feel
Yes.
that that's a problem that that you've seen definitely in New York State and that you would like to be addressed. And I know this has a federal level connection as well. So tell us about why wrongful convictions you see as a problem at the Bar Association.
Well, the federal impact would be this whole issue of mass incarceration that we're talking about. The wrongful conviction part is a very specific piece of that. Our past president, Glenn Lauke, who preceded me, worked closely with the District Attorneys Association and the Innocence Project on two opposite sides, and brought them to the table, and we came up with a package that would, for legislative action in the state, that would help with wrongful convictions, both with video interrogations of witnesses and what's called blind and double-blind photo analysis. And, what we found in dealing with the district attorneys and the Innocence Project, two opposite sides, basically, of a case, is that nobody wants a wrongful conviction.
Of course.
If someone is innocent, neither side wants them to be prosecuted or convicted. And if you do that, then that means the actual criminal is still out there, and neither side wants that. And so we worked based upon that common understanding and that common cause. We worked together with them and came up with a proposal that could, I think, help with wrongful convictions on those two areas. Brought it to the legislature, lobbied on both sides, got it through the Senate, did not get it through the Assembly, and we're hoping that this year we're going to get both, and
So
we're going to keep pushing for it.
What was the sense of why it did not get through the Assembly? What was the hold
Politics.
up? Politics. Yeah, it's just the timing. It wasn't that there was not, some level of support for it in the Assembly.
I think in the Senate we had bipartisan support. I think it was like 54-6. So it's not necessarily, I mean, this is something that both sides can really come together on. It can be a real win for the state of New York. Some might say, well, we need more. We need, better precautions against wrongful convictions, and I don't think that there would anybody that would disagree with that. But this is what we can get now.
Gotcha.
We can be better. We can be a better state. We can start helping things now with this legislation, and I'm looking forward to having it get through the legislature this year. There was so much going on,
of course,
last year with the changes in leadership that there was a lot of distraction. We hope that this can be a real win, I think, for both sides of the aisle.
Is this a sense where, I mean, I know basically Albany works in two paths. You have, legislation that gets tied to the budget and therefore it gets done. Then you have the end of the session where everything kind of gets tied together to some level, and there's a lot of technical details that need to get worked out. Is your sense that this needs to be at least attached to the budget in some level, or do you think that there's still...
There's not a huge budget implication to this. There
okay.
might be some, but the think about the budget implication of putting someone in jail that doesn't belong there.
Of course.
So there is some. I mean, we're talking about having more video interrogation equipment, but the issue of the cost of that maybe we faced 10 years ago is something that is really now de minimis because of technology.
Great. David Miranda, President of the Bar Association, thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you for having me. It's been wonderful to be here.